Act 1, Chapter 2, Homecoming. Long shadows greeted Aidele as she rode through the front gate of Grandfather's ranch. A cool wind caused her tended wounds to throb achingly. They would have to be fully dressed, and soon, she reckoned. The pain was getting so bad, it was as if someone had spent the last week massaging her with a meat tenderizer. Based on her tattered shirt, she looked the part, too. She reached up to the back of her neck, hair a tangled mess, and steeped in sweat and rubbed. A bead of sweat rode into her eye, and she winced. God damn it. The palm of her hand went up. Fuck. After I put you up, boy, I'm getting a nice long bath. I smell like I've been rolling in a slaughterhouse. Mesmerized whinnied as she brought him into his pen. Don't worry, I'm going to take care of you first. Whew. Think you need a bath, too. Aidele patted his neck, bringing him to a stop near his enclosed shelter. She dismounted and went to work, removing his reins and saddle, and took them into the barn. Exhaustion permeated every pore in her body and weighed on her mind. The months had flown by in her quest, and she was glad it culminated in a town only a day's ride to the southwest. Rented City. What a cesspool. Hope never to see that damn place again. She exited the barn and saw him mesmerized at his trough, lapping at the water with audible eagerness. She smiled, grabbing a bale of hay off of a tall stack and tossed it down for him. Her hand went to her shoulder to rub as she cracked her neck. Yep, I need a drink too, old friend. Memories flooded her mind. His breed was of the marset, a rare equine species native to the wastelands that only a handful of people knew how to sire. Grandfather was one of their numbers. Mesmerized had been presented to her when he was but a foal. She'd been a foal herself, barely 8 years of age, and hardly as tall as him. He was a gift after they'd finally moved from Aqua Mons to the ranch, and they'd been inseparable ever since. Always he'd come rushing up to see her when she came out to the pen where he and his siblings frolicked. She'd named him Mesmerized due to his shiny, multicolored coat that would shift from a deep violet to a crimson red, depending on what angle you were looking at him from. His thick mane fell to just below his shoulders and was silky smooth. And his eyes, oh, his eyes, were orbs of shifting vivid blues and violet reds. Hypnotic. It wasn't until she was 12 that she'd learned to properly ride him. By then he was twice as tall with a lithe frame and rippling musculature from snout to shank. Mesmerized trotted past her and towards his bedding where he performed a tight little circle and flopped down with an audible flutter of his lips. Aidele laughed and shook her head. You did a good job, oh boy. Couldn't have done it without you. She went towards the barn, saw that the other Marzets were already in their own stables. Mesmerized had his own shelter built along the outer edge of the barn. She'd wanted him to have his own place and had built it herself some years ago, and shut the doors up. Then passed by Mesmerized, giving a gentle wave. I'll wash you tomorrow. Sleep well. She went to the pen gate, closed it behind her, then made her way across the darkening yard to the ranch house. Mesmerized was asleep before the screen door had even shut behind her. Aidele shut the creaky wooden door and twisted towards a coat rack to hang up her tattered duster. She ran a hand down it and frowned. Hope this can be repaired, she thought. Looks as rough as me. It had once been her mother's. Now she wore it to honor her memory. There was no way she couldn't at least try to mend the bitter signs of distress and degraded wear, pot-marking its surface. She stepped back and knelt to the floor to remove her boots. A voice echoed out of the kitchen from down the hall, adjoining the well-lit living room surrounding her. That you, Aidele? She grunted in reply, looking across the room. The den was to the back wall, its doors closed, lights out. From her perspective, the main corridor was left of that room, running until it dead-ended into the laundry facilities at the end. She could even see the back door from her stoop, its left wall running towards her and the front door until it met the entryway to the massive screened-in recreational room. From the kitchen, halfway down the corridor, she saw Grandfather coming her way holding a bowl and mixing its contents with a spoon. He stopped cold when he saw her and placed the bowl on a console halfway down the hall. "Aidele, what happened to you? Are you all right?" He rushed towards her, and she stood up to raise a hand, halting his forward motion just 5 feet from her, his mouth hanging open, eyes wide. A smile crossed her face, and she almost laughed. Grandfather was a tall, bulky man with a belly that had seen too much red meat and beer over his long years. His gray hair was braided up into 2 cords, one draped over each shoulder. The old Chahookan continued to stare at her from behind dark brown eyes, his wrinkled visage full of concern. Her smile diminished slightly. "It's done, Grandfather." Aidele pressed a hand to her wounded shoulder, feeling it pulse angrily. "I've succeeded. Kern Michaels and his revolting crew are dead." It hadn't seemed possible his eyes could get any wider, but they did. "I've succeeded." The words came out in stunned confusion. His head bobbed. "Your clothes are in tatters, soaked in what I can only assume is blood. Every inch of you looks like you've been to war." Aidele nodded. "I feel like it too. I'm about to go properly dress these wounds. I just wanted you to know first. You can rest easy. This valley is safe from the likes of Kern Michaels." Grandfather straightened to his full height, mouth shut with an audible clack, and shook his head. Turning back the way he came, Grandfather grabbed his bow and made back for the kitchen. Aidele could have sworn he was muttering under his breath. She shook her own head slowly, mouth falling open. She then ambled off after him, the bullet hole in her thigh screaming to be tended. In the kitchen, she found him at the stove mixing a boiling pot. He reached up into a cupboard and pulled out some spices and added some portions to the pot. "That's it?" she asked, standing in the doorway. For almost a minute he stood mixing with a wooden spoon, silent to her question. Whether he was ruminating over an answer or ignoring her entirely, she wasn't entirely certain. She was opening her mouth to ask when he looked at her peripherally and huffed. "Did you expect more from me? Expectations can be disappointing, it would seem." Aidele inhaled deeply, exhaled, and entered the room. "I know you didn't agree with me going after him. I get it. But I thought you'd at least be happy that I brought my father's killer to justice." Grandfather kept at his task as he spoke. "I'm glad you're safe. I was worried when you tore out of here months ago, as if you'd lost your mind. I entertained the thought you'd gone off into the mountains to find it again, and that was why you couldn't send word of your condition." His shoulders hunched a nearly imperceptible degree. Nausea worked its way through her gut, and a slight lightheadedness narrowed her focus to the small table at the center of the room. She rubbed her wounded arm, barely aware of the aching as a result. She was a haggard, beaten person, having yet to look at herself in a reflection. The truth was, she hadn't even considered how she'd look to him, how he would react to seeing a bloodied, swollen face, poofy eyes, and shot-up clothing. She fought hard to keep that knot out of her throat, tears out of her eyes. Her teeth gritted, her jaw clenched, and she cleared her throat of any choked cries. And what would you have had me done? Forget about it? Let him go about his merry way, murdering and raping his way across the countryside?" Grandfather looked towards her, mouth taut, lips downturned. He turned down the burner temperature, placed a spoon in his cradle, and turned to lean against the counter as Aidele pulled out a chair at the table in the center of the room, legs grinding the floor in a bumpy, scraping growl, and sat down. "Did you really expect me to be happy about this?" He grabbed a dish towel off the countertop and dried his hands. "My daughter, your mother, is 5 years past, haven't taken her long walk. My son-in-law, murdered at the hands of outlaws. His long walk only just beginning. Now my granddaughter, young and vibrant, has given in to the bloodlust of vengeance, hell-bent on joining them. Happy is the furthest emotion from my heart. Sorrel sits there, rubbing its hands callously. Look at you!" His eyes took her in, as if they no longer recognized who she was anymore. She stifled a shudder as he shook his head and went to the refrigerator. After a moment, He pulled out 2 beers, closed the door, and popped their caps off with the bottle opener built into the door's surface. Grandfather walked towards her and sat the cold beverage in front of her, then proceeded to chug his own and go back for another. Aidele sighed and downed half of hers. She rested the bottle in her hand on the tabletop. Grandfather watched her mournfully. A man like that, Grandfather slowly continued, can't be allowed to flourish in the backs of innocents. You're right. However, don't sit there lying to yourself or to me. This wasn't an altruistic act to save the wastelands. Revenge is a double-edged sword. It allows one to think they are fighting for justice when really they have only invited in the worst parts of themselves. Violence begets more violence, with no end when wielded. It changes a person, just as it has you. Listen to your words. You have embedded yourself so deeply into this narrative of yours, you even speak like one of them now. Aidele slammed the edge of her fist on the table so hard her now empty bottle tipped over. That son of a bitch has been plaguing these parts for months, and you think no good comes from ridding us of him? My father deserved better. And how I talk don't got jack to do with squat. Grandfather waved his hand. If you insist, but these matters are for the authorities to handle. You've always been quick-tempered and ready to fight, granddaughter, but this taking the law into your own hands reminds me of that time you went after that woman. I don't want to talk about that bitch. Aidele scoffed and leaned back into her chair, eyes narrowed. Everything I've done for justice. You've done it for yourself. You've taken this mad quest and murdered your enemy. How long before your thirst demands you find new enemies to take their places? Aidele pushed away from the table and leapt up, knocking the chair over. I'm done with this conversation. I'm going to bed. Wait. Aidele stopped at the hallway on the other side of the kitchen leading to the bedrooms and the back side of the house. His tone lowered and she barely looked back at him. You shouldn't go to bed hungry, let alone angry. Dinner will be ready in a few hours. Come back and eat. If you don't wish to talk, I'll say nothing. Tend to your wounds thoroughly, though, and remember the antiseptic. You don't want to get an infection. But remember this, granddaughter. Pain might not affect you the way it does most, but every time I see you like this, it hurts me. No words answered, only her stare and a clenched jaw. She turned her gaze back to the corridor and continued onward, leaving Grandfather to sigh deeply and go about finishing dinner. God damn it! Aidele hissed, drawing in a sharp breath and leading the needle and plastic thread through her shoulder wound. She sat on the toilet, working feverishly to finish the job. Beside her was a tub full of bloody water with the bottle of disinfectant on its rim. The bullet to her hip had gone straight through, leaving the easiest of the injuries to contend with. The one to her thigh, though, had to be dug out to copious amounts of cursing. She put the end of the thread in her teeth and tied the suture off with her free hand, thinking. One thing the wastelands could use is a goddamn hospital. Tired of always having to sew myself up. She finished tying off and cut the thread ends down. Hell, I'd settle for a decent medic instead of these hack-traveling doctors going town to town. Or the mortician. Aidele sighed and stood up to look at herself in the mirror. Looking deep into her nude reflection, she experienced a sensation of being out of her body, like she wasn't even real. And she was just watching the tottering antics of some sublimely pathetic beast that overestimated its worth. It's not real, Aidele thought. It's just another world. Every bone ached, every inch throbbed. It was as if every second spent chasing Kern had made her ancient, she considered. She leaned forward and reached into the sink with great convulsive heaves, her hands gripping the porcelain sides tightly. The months she'd spent bringing justice to the wastelands came exploding to the forefront of memory. Her mind's eye wouldn't turn away from the faces of those she'd put down. Blood-painted walls, grounds slick in gore, mounds of shredded flesh and guts, the terror deep in the eyes of dead men. All surged through her mind uncontrollably, and she continued to heave until her legs felt like jelly. Her throat was raw, her arms quaked, and her vision blurred as tears intermingled with her regurgitated soul. It didn't end until she was dry heaving, and her chest was writhing in sobs. Aidele fell to her knees and leaned her forehead against the sink's front. It was impossible to stop. The horror that was spiking her head wouldn't leave her be. It was a eulogy to all she'd lost. Her father, her mother, her innocence, and herself. And of course, there were the waves of flesh she'd forced herself to fire through to get at Kern and finalize her revenge. Maybe Grandfather was right, she thought. Maybe I did do it for myself. There was a void enveloping her heart. It reached out and took hold of every aspect of her being. It wasn't something that could be dressed up, prettied, and put away. She collapsed to the floor, bawling up in the process, and tried not to let her cries grow louder. The last thing she needed, was an "I told you so" from Grandfather, though there was doubt he would. The greater likelihood was a mournful expression of understanding, and that would be worse. However long she lied there, she couldn't say, but she got back to her knees, wiped her hands across her face, and pulled herself back up to the mirror. Within its haunted recesses, she saw a slobbering mess. She turned on the faucet and rinsed away the sick, then washed her face off. Collecting herself, she dried off, then wrapped a towel around her still wet hair. I'm not hungry. She glared at the creature in the mirror, its eyes still puffy. Girl, you better make an effort of it. Grandfather made no attempt at conversation. The only sounds in the kitchen were the clinking of silverware on plates. Neither of them seemed to have much of an appetite, as the silence between them hung as a dark cloud of gnats. He didn't even bother looking at her, only had set the table and doled out bowls of stew and potatoes. Regardless of how delicious it really was, she'd only managed a few bites before simply staring it absently, staring into its depths. Thank you for dinner, Aidele said flatly, and stood up. Before she could get far, Grandfather spoke. I know I said I would not say anything if you did not wish it, but I almost forgot that I found something of your father's you might want. She paused and looked back at him as he rose and went to a drawer. He pulled out a strapped leather-bound journal. He approached her and held it outward. Cooper wrote much. This is hidden in a wall panel behind his bed. Wish he'd asked me first before putting holes in my wall. Grandfather offered a wan smile. Aidele hesitated, then took it from him. She ran her hand slowly across its smooth surface. It was dyed brown and was hefty, as if the words inside had their own gravity. I don't understand everything within its pages, Grandfather continued. There are descriptions and drawings throughout that seemed important to him. I'm sure you will have a deeper insight into their meaning given how often you worked with him out in the workshop. I figure that if you're feeling lost, maybe his words will help you find your way back. Aidele's jaw tensed and her eyes narrowed. A knot welled in her throat and she offered the journal back. It's fine. I already know all I need to know about myself and my father. Grandfather held his hands up and looked away. No, granddaughter. Those are your father's words. And just for the record, no matter how you protest, I will never stop worrying about you. Grandfather left, heading down the hall to his room. A short time later, she heard the door to his bedroom click shut. It took a few moments longer for her to pull her eyes away from the bend in the hall and down to the journal. Slowly, she pulled the journal to her chest and stared out to a distance beyond the walls of her home. After a moment longer, she forced her feet to move and headed to her own room, near the end of the hall, and stopped. The very last door, standing closed, was her father's. An eternity seemed to pass before she was able to tear her eyes away from that door and reach for her own doorknob. Entering her room, she nudged her own door closed with a muffled click and tossed the journal onto her bed. It made a heavy thump. At the dresser near her door, she sat down heavily and unwrapped the towel around her head. Her mind was blank as she reached for a brush and tested her hair with her other hand. Only a few spots were still moist. She allowed the raven-black bunch of hair to fall to her mid-back and tenderly ran the brush through matted locks. Working through them, her gaze fell into her own eyes. A haze fell over her like a blanket, and her hand stopped in mid-stroke as she saw the journal through the mirror. Dad. There were 5 regions that made up the wastelands. The spine in the north which was a mountainous zone with its centerpiece being the main skeletal range running east to west for nearly 1,000 miles. The deltas, the zone that started at the edge of the spine, ran all the way from the north down and around to the east until it collided with a series of tall valleys known as the Reach of Vales, and also far to the south where the wastelands ended. There, great forests and lakes and marshes were the main features of interest. The crags far to the west that were a wall of collapsed stone and hazardous terrain that collided with the very end of the spine and ringed around to the southernmost region. The dustlands, a massive funnel of wind and dust made up a constant storm blowing across from a western canyon. Beyond the crags and far to the east were a small desert divided the end of the storm's influence from that of the southernmost reaches of the deltas. The fifth region that sat pretty much in the middle of all of this was called the Sutures, an arid, cracked zone full of ragged, difficult to navigate terrain with a collection of tortured, bumpy dunes. Scattered sporadically were patches of stiff, hair-like brown grass common to this region, known as pissweed, though its official name was Helenium. There were very few other instances of vegetation, but most of it was either hard, stone-like wood, rising up as leafless trees, sporting spiny needles and looking like claws reaching out of the lifeless earth towards the unforgiving skies, or clumps of desert grasses that were quick to cut if one wasn't careful. What wildlife was to be found was as vicious as the denizens who called the Sutures home, and towards the northern half of the Sutures, just 12 miles away from the spine, was a sunken depression that looked like a shallow crater or a former lake bed. This half-mile wide, isolated place played host to the home of Garrett Lester, Aidele's grandfather. It was here that he'd built his ranch so many decades ago. Aidele and her father lived here in relative peace, the loss of her mother 5 years earlier notwithstanding. Until that fateful day 3 months past. Aidele had been coming out of the barn where she was tending to the marsets when she saw her father's buggy zooming up to the house. He looked frazzled and didn't bother parking in a lot beside the home. Instead, he leapt out just after a skidding stop and raced up the short stairs and inside. He was yelling something almost immediately, causing her to frantically cross the yard in a run and follow him inside herself. His voice was echoing down the hall, and she knew then he'd gone straight to grandfather's room. She hurried through the kitchen, around the first bend of the bedroom corridor, and towards the first door on her right. Voices became more distinct, rather than the mumbled, disembodied sounds they'd been moments earlier. Waiting for me, Garrett? I already said no, but I don't know that they'll accept that as an answer. I never should have invented the damn thing. Now, hold on, Coop. You don't know that's what they were after. They're only talking about one journal. Of course it is. What else could it be? How would I even know about it? Aidele came to the doorway and looked in. Her father was pacing the center of the room, his hands clawing at his short brown hair with touches of gray around his sideburns. His glasses beamed reflected light. His grandfather sat in his rocking chair, leaning forward and watching him with furrowed brows. I don't know. What do you think the Union would... Grandfather saw her standing there, hand to chest, panic evident on her face. Granddaughter, I didn't see you there. Was there something you needed? Her father stopped, ran his hand through his hair to straighten it, and looked to her with a smile. Seeing the wiry, thin man standing there in his tan tweed jacket and blue jeans, wearing a nervous, fearful expression, filled Aidele with a welling trepidation. Aidele, honey, sorry to worry you. I should have come and said hi first. What's wrong? Is something the matter? He raised his hand to rub his temple. It's nothing to worry about, just work-related issues. His thinly mustached lip quivered, and then his smile grew brighter. That's it, you can help me. Grandfather frowned as her father snapped his fingers. Are you sure about that, Cooper? You were just expressing your own concerns. I don't see much other choice. I don't know who spilled the beans, but it isn't relevant. It just has to get moved before words are the last thing that they're after. Her father rushed past her and out into the hallway. She looked at grandfather and furrowed her brow. Grandfather shrugged and stood up. He said nothing as he followed Cooper to his room at the end of the bedroom corridor. How long do you plan on being gone, Coop? Grandfather asked, entering his bedroom. Her father was busy throwing clothing into a duffel bag. He didn't look at them as they stopped before his bed. Maybe 3 or 4 days. Oh, you should pack too. Oh, I'm sorry. I never asked if you would go with me. I just assumed. He stood straight and walked towards Aidele, hazel eyes bright with his question. She shook her head, still confused. I don't even know what's going on, but yeah, I'll go. All you had to do was ask. He went back to the task of packing. Excellent. I'll fill you in on the details once we're on the train. The train? Where are we going? To the labs. Why are we going to the labs? I haven't been there since I was like 12. Don't worry. All will be revealed. Cooper looked at Garrett. You still have the place in Kanaza? Kanaza? Yeah. But why do you want to go all the way out there? Garrett questioned, crossing his arms. Out of the way. Nobody would think to look for me there. The more she heard, the more alarmed she became. You said you'd just be gone a few days. This is sounding more like a week. Grandfather quirked a brow. You're just going to leave an old man alone for a week? Her father clasped him on the arm. Garrett, I've never known you to be helpless. We'll be back as soon as we can. Grandfather chuckled as her father stared at the wall behind his bed. Shit. He went to the bed and zipped up the duffel bag, and then left it there as he turned to the two. Aidele felt her mouth go dry. Why won't you tell me what's going on? Her father smiled. On the train. Until then, pack for a week, I guess. Along the way to the station, we'll grab lunch. Stop worrying so much. It'll be fine. He walked past them and towards the front porch. I need to head to Chesapeake Villa. I forgot there's a matter I have to deal with before we leave. Aidele and Grandfather followed him down the corridor, through the kitchen, past the living room, and out to the porch, where he took the 3 steps in a single bound and hurried to his buggy. Getting into the driver's seat, he looked at them and waved. I'll be back soon. Aidele watched him turn the little 4-wheeled vehicle on, its roll cage vibrating under the strange, whirring buzz it made. The 2 bubble headlights up front reminded Aidele of some sort of angry bug. It pulled forward and turned around to head back to the east exit of the property. A dust trail followed her father as he picked up speed and drove to the front gate. Grandfather went back into the house, leaving Aidele alone on the porch to watch in silence until the little open-air buggy disappeared around the far bend, leading out towards Chesapeake Villa. The village itself wasn't very far, maybe half an hour by buggy going at a decent clip, and her father was a leadfoot, so she figured maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours he'd be back, depending on what it was he had to do in town. She turned back to the house. For the next couple of hours, Aidele took her time packing and preparing for her impromptu trip. She made sure to bring plenty of clothes, basic toiletries, and her brush. When done with that, she took her own duffel bag and sat it beside her father's, then went out to the porch to wait. She pulled a timepiece out of her jeans pocket and saw that it was just past noon. Putting it back, she looked up to a vivid blue sky and saw a light rainbow of color ripple across the broad expanse from horizon to horizon. She sighed inwardly. He'd already been gone 2 hours. So much for lunch. She decided to go brush out Mesmerize. After a while, she grew bored of that and went back to the porch to read. She glanced up, saw that the sun was further along in the sky, and looked at her timepiece again. Another hour had come and gone. I thought he was in a hurry. Aidele folded her book shut, placed it on a small table by the porch swing, and stood up to walk across the yard to the Marzit pen. She whistled for Mesmerize as she entered and headed towards the barn. He came bounding towards her eagerly. Grabbing his saddle and reins, she went to work gearing him up, and then rode out towards the southern edge of the property. Once there, she dismounted and hung the reins around the saddle horn and patted Mesmerize's neck. Stay. Next came a grueling climb up the embankment ridge. It was 20 feet high and steeply sloped, but had plenty of footholds and stone outcroppings to grab onto. At the summit, she got her balance between the sharp fall-off into the ranch perimeter and the gentle sloping scarp down towards the flattish expanse of the sutures. From here, she could see the entirety of the ranch. The house looked almost like a model from this vantage, and the crops surrounding it spanned out for thousands of feet in every direction, almost reaching the borders of the homestead ridges. There were only two ways in and out of the ranch that didn't involve a steep, perilous climb. Well-worn paths running eastward and through a series of raggedy dunes towards Chesapeake Villa, and a southwestern entrance running towards the smooth plains of Trenton's Way. Yet, her focus was not in the ranch this day. It was out towards the north. The sun was working its way west, but the day was unnaturally bright, as if someone had turned on a brilliant floodlight. She raised a hand to her brow and scanned the northern horizon. There was a shallow run of mountains so low from this vantage they might as well be a mirage of raised dirt. Closer and clearer to see was the beginning formation of the spine, its monstrous form running all the way west to vanish out of sight. A little closer than that, and just a few dozen miles southeast of the spine, was Chesapeake Villa. Here, just a small speck of gray-brown. Other than these sights, the horizon from east to west was the dry, torn-up terrain of the sutures. To the southeast, she saw a rising poof of dust, rolling towards the Scranton ravine over the horizon. Whoever was riding so hard and so fast were little more than hazy black dots. She scanned back out north, and her gaze fell on a spot halfway between Chesapeake and the ranch. An almost invisible trail of smoke was rising up from the outer dunes reaches. She screwed up her face. Campfire? In the middle of the afternoon? But who'd be in the middle of... Her hand dropped, and eyes widened. A pained gasp escaped her lips, and a terrible fear sat in her heart. She turned back to the steep decline and skidded down towards Mesmerize, who was chomping at some patches of pissweed. She wasted no time mounting up and guiding him out towards the eastern exit. Her heart ached to just tear up over the rise and ride straight across to the smoky mystery, but the terrain of the dunes was too rough and jagged. Mesmerize would surely fall or twist a foot. Sticking to the path that had carefully been dug out by her grandfather over the years was far safer, though it meant a longer ride, with that terror clawing at her gut. Nearly an hour passed, as she pushed Mesmerize as hard as she dared around the bends, keeping an eye out for potholes and cracks. All the while, the brief glimpses of the smoke trail grew thinner and thinner. By the time of her arrival, the smoke was practically non-existent. She pulled Mesmerize to a stop upon seeing the source of the fire, her father's overturned buggy. She dismounted and raced towards the vehicle. "Dad! Dad, say something!" A small fire still sizzled inside the buggy as she slung herself to her knees, skidding to a stop beside the bullet-ridden hall. Bullets? She looked inside and saw no one there. Burnt papers littered the ground all around. The roll bar over the driver's seat was bent inward. The seats within were little more than skeletal remains. The driver's side door was laying several feet away from the vehicle. Tears flowed from her eyes as smoke blasted her face. Panic wrecked her mind. Aidele stood up and cupped her hands to her mouth. "Father!" She took in the whole scene, looking for any signs of him. Debris was everywhere, and some brush had caught fire. Behind her, she saw a large dune, half of it more a small cliff of dirt, and raced towards it. Tracks led up to its summit, clearly indicating this was where he'd been driven off the dusty road. "Bullets. He was shot at." She grunted, clawing her way to the top. "Oh, spirits, please, please, please." A hard wind whipped at her hair and caused the remaining smoke below to blow horizontally. She looked hard at the surrounding area and froze in horror. Roughly 100 feet away, she could see a pair of booted legs sticking out of a copse of brush. "Dad!" She screamed and skidded down the dune. Racing there, she found her father's body laying on its stomach. She turned him over and saw the grimacing face of death. He'd been shot 6 times, and she started trembling. She checked for a pulse and found none. Knew none would be there. She knelt there, stunned and unable to move. "No spirits. What do I do? Dad!" Her gaze fixated on the brush surrounding him, numbness keeping her from acting. "Okay, stop it. Get going. Move!" Mesmerize snorted and she came out of her daze. She drew her hand back, stood up, and went to grab Mesmerize. She led him over to her father and then struggled to get his body lashed behind the saddle. Tension was already starting to take a hold of his body. Adelaide finished latching her father down and then mounted the saddle. She turned, mesmerized around, and pushed him towards the road and back into a run towards the ranch. Her mind was a haze, the rest of the day a blur. It was a haunting nightmare that would always be there to stir up the rage, the hate, the sorrow, and always leave her to wonder if she shouldn't have just ridden out earlier. Mesmerized careened through the gate, and she brought him to a stop just outside the house. She dismounted and started for the door and then stopped. Her eyes were wide, her red skin pale. A hateful scream rang out. It seemed far away, but deep down she knew it was coming from herself. She forced herself to the doorway, and as she opened the screen door, saw Grandfather racing out of the kitchen towards her. Aidele, what is it? What's wrong? My father, no! She screamed again, tears flowing. He's dead! Out there, I'm mesmerized. I found him! Grandfather's mouth dropped. She let another scream loose. He raced past her and out into the porch. Aidele forced herself to follow. Grandfather's hands went to his temples, the flats of his palms gripping his head like he was about to smash it. What? Who? Why? Who would do this? And you're sure? Grandfather rushed forward to search for a pulse. Her father's face told him the truth. He took a step back, turned to Aidele, dropping his hands, and came to her sobbing and took her into his arms. By the spirits, oh, Aidele. The moments passed, and then Grandfather drew back. Okay, we need to take care of him. Help me take him to the workshop. Aidele nodded, and they guided Mesmerized around the house to the workshop. They carefully took him down and carried him inside. There they laid his body on the work table in the center of the room. She raced inside the house to grab a blanket from a hallway closet. She couldn't remember if she had thought to do that, or if Grandfather had asked. Whichever the case, the end result was her standing in the hall, cradling a blanket to her chest. She knelt to her knees and fell back against the wall. After a time, Grandfather's hand came to rest on her shoulder. She looked up to him through blurry eyes. Can you sit with your father? I'll head into town to fetch the sheriff. There was a certainty that she nodded, but she didn't feel like herself. It was as if she was trapped in some horrible nightmare. All right, Grandfather said. Come help me cover him. When I return, we'll prepare your father for the pyre. Where was it that you found him? A slight hesitation that felt for the world like it dragged on forever. Then, along the Chesapeake Trail, at the edge of the South Bend Dunes, off the rise. Grandfather nodded and helped her to her feet. They went back out to the workshop and covered her father up. Aidele sat down in a chair near the table while Grandfather headed out. Time ceased, became meaningless. All that existed was the corpse of her father on the table. Grandfather could have been gone minutes or 100 years. By the time he'd returned, she was still sitting there in a daze. The sheriff tried to ask her questions, and maybe she mumbled an answer. Whatever she said, he offered only a sad nod of the head and a sorry for her loss, then wandered off when the deputy arrived. Nearby, the undertaker had arrived as well. Well, what'd you discover? The sheriff asked, trying to keep his voice low and filling. It was a real mess, Sheriff. I don't know what happened, but it looks like old Coop drove right off a dune and done tore himself up. Don't explain the bullets, kid. Well, I did hear some of the boys talking, and they thinks it might have been bandits. Wouldn't know why, though. Don't look like anything was took. Professor belongings were everywhere, and his credits are still in his wallet. Delson says he and Martin found tracks leading up towards Merkel's trail, though. They say they made 10 to 12 horses. The sheriff scowled. Shit. Damn shame what this world's coming to. Drum up some scouts and go check it out. You thinking it was bandits then? The sheriff glanced towards Aidele. I'll tell you what. Let's take this conversation elsewhere. The two men walked away. Aidele didn't care. They were just words and couldn't fill in the void building in her soul. The evening wore on, and the next thing she knew, she was standing at her father's funeral pyre. The flames licked the clear black sky. Billowing smoke, thick and choking, rose high into the night air. The smell of charred flesh was heavy. She was vaguely aware of the twinkling stars high above. Her father always did love to see those brilliant specks of light flickering in a dark night. Aidele remained standing there, a blanket wrapped around her that she'd picked up from somewhere or someone had given her. She couldn't remember. There she stayed until the fire had died down, and all that was left was cinder, ash, and bits of bone. One by one, those gathered to pay their respects had left, until it was only her and grandfather, and he had rubbed her back and left some time earlier. Now it was just her. She turned from the smoking ruin and headed back to the house, trying desperately to put out of mind the troubling thought this was where her mother's long walk had begun too. Aidele spent the next week in a near comatose state. Despite grandfather's urgings to join him going to town, she repeatedly refused, electing to remain staring at her window or at a wall. She barely ate and could barely think. After a week, she agreed to go with grandfather to town and start filling her time caring for the animals and doting on Mesmerize. Grandfather had started taking her to town on their old wagon rather than the buggy. Apparently he felt that the open air and the gentle rocking of wheels on tattered soil was good for her spirit. A week and a half later, Aidele was sitting in the wagon outside the general store, waiting to help grandfather load some supplies. The day was sweltering and she'd been fanning herself with a hand paddle. By chance, 2 people walked by having a loud conversation. Usually Aidele would just ignore whatever gossip was being slung that day, but this particular conversation caught her attention immediately. "Rising to hold the suitures for the last year," the man, tall and wearing a fancy coat and top hat, was saying to the woman with him. She was fanning herself with a frilly folding fan. Hicks sure swore that gang had never been around before. But all of a sudden, here they are, running roughshod all across the place. Why, I even heard tell a professor, mind you, was murdered out by the spine just a few weeks ago.
That's terrible. Why would they do such a thing?
The woman replied, her hand going to her chest daintily. Aidele knitted her brows and felt a heat swell in her heart. She leapt off the wagon. "Oh, who knows with these heathens?" the man continued. "If we had any competent lawmen out here, we wouldn't even be having this conversation, and certainly those outlaws would be a thing of the past."
"Indeed,"
the woman replied, batting at her bell-shaped dress as she struggled not to trip over an upraised wooden panel of deck. Aidele rushed up to them.
Hey! Who was it? Who killed that professor?"
They both stopped and turned towards her. The man cocked his head. "Pardon me, what was that?"
"I heard you saying a gang of outlaws killed a professor. Who was that gang?"
Aidele came to a stop, her body tense. The man lifted a hand to his chest, fingers clawed out towards himself, looking like he'd just smelt the ripest of farts. "Young lady, it is extremely rude of you to go eavesdropping on private conversations." Aidele scowled.
"I wasn't eavesdropping. You two are talking so loud it's amazing the whole town doesn't know your business."
"Well, I never," he remarked.
"That professor killed was my father, and I want to know the monsters who did him in."
The man's jaw dropped as he turned a pale white and took a step back.
"Oh, my. Oh, no. I'm sorry, my dear, but never you mind those thugs. Let the law deal with them. My apologies for your loss. But these are brutes who a little lady such as yourself shouldn't even speak to, let alone engage in fisticuffs."
Aidele growled.
"I don't need your sympathies, and I'm not looking to have a conversation with them. I'm looking to kill them."
The man gasped, his mouth as wide as a grimace on a freshly caught bass. The woman with him gave a wry grin and looked at Aidele.
"Kern Michaels. It's the Kern Michaels gang."
"Delilah!" The man stared down at her. "Delilah, how could you?" Aidele lowered her eyes.
"Thank you."
The man grabbed the woman by the arm and escorted her away, all the while admonishing her. "What did you do? We're not trying to have the deaths of sweet little things on our consciences."
"You just said the law was useless."
She looked up at him, smile waning.
"Maybe she'll do something about it."
Aidele ignored them and turned back towards the wagon. She walked slowly, looking down to the ground, mulling over the information she'd just been granted.
"I have a name now. Kern Michaels. The Kern Michaels gang.
She was so deep into her own thoughts she didn't notice the man right in front of her before plowing headlong into his chest. "Whoa there, little lady," he laughed affably and took her by the shoulders. "You gotta look where you're going." She looked up at him, her straw hat having fallen across her back and now hanging by its strings.
Kern Michaels,
she muttered. Kern Michaels? The man's smile faded. Did he do something to you? Are you needing help?
No. Yes, she shook her head. I need to find him.
The man frowned. Don't know nobody who wants to find that miserable SOB. Excuse my language, ma'am. Last I heard, he was out near Trayton. But take my advice, miss. You stay as far away from that cur as possible. He's all sorts of murdering bad news. The man tipped his hat to her and continued on his way. Aidele looked towards the wagon and mumbled to herself. No fucking shit. A thought struck her and she hurried towards the jailhouse just across the street. She rushed inside and saw the sheriff sitting there reading a book. He looked up as she plopped her hands on his desk and spewed out a long, unbroken string of words.
Kern Michaels killed my father and he's holed up in Trayton so we can get a posse together and go after the bastard.
She was practically panting in her eagerness. The bespectacled sheriff was nonplussed. He bookmarked where he was reading, leaned back into his chair, and removed his glasses, never shifting his eyes from Aidele. "Okay, now hold your horses for a moment, Miss Wilson. What's this all about?"
You heard me. Kern Michaels is in Trenton. We can bring the son of a bitch to justice. Just get a crew together and...
Okay. The sheriff leaned forward with a creak of his chair, placing his glasses and book on the desktop and clasped his hands together. "The investigation of your father's death is still ongoing. We don't know what actually happened. Our scouts traced the tracks out towards Calford until they vanished in Besson County. That's nowhere near Trayton. It's in the opposite direction, in fact. And even if what you say is true, Trayton is out of our jurisdiction.
But we...
The sheriff held up a hand. "I'm convinced, though. We're dealing with raiders from out of the canyons. We're taking care of the justice part, Miss Wilson. It's not Kern Michaels. You don't want to mess with that outlaw anyhow. Just go home, mind your ranch, do some knitting. Leave the gangs to us. I'll keep you informed about what we find out and when." The sheriff picked his glasses up, put them on, grabbed his book, and leaned back into his chair. He opened the book back up and resumed reading. Aidele scoffed and turned to leave the office. The sense that his eyes were watching her retreat was strong, but she refused to look back and exited the building. She stormed back down the street towards the wagon where Grandfather was now loading up bags of goods. He saw her coming and waved, but his smile faded upon seeing the snarl on her face. She walked over to his purchases where they were stacked on a store cart and grabbed a bag of wheat. She went to the wagon and chucked it into the back. Then went back for a bag of rice and repeated the process over and over, faster and faster, furiouser and furiouser. The anger wouldn't abate. Grandfather stepped in front of her after trying to get her to stop. Okay, careful there. You're going to hurt yourself. What's wrong?" She tried to speak, tried to say anything, but found she could only toss the bag and go back for another. "If you don't wish to tell me what's stuck up your craw, that's fine. But do me a favor. Don't take it out on the groceries. It cost me an arm and a leg." Aidele looked at him and let loose a long breath, then started loading the wagon slower and more carefully. It somehow helped her calm down. Once the task was complete, Grandfather took the cart back into the store, while she got into the front bench. Grandfather came back and got into the driver's position to whip the Marzettes into motion. Aidele, however, might have calmed down, but the burning was deep within now. Her whole world became a red, angry fire. "I value your privacy, Aidele," Grandfather said. "However, your silence is deafening. What happened in town? I saw you coming from the jailhouse. Dare I ask why?" Aidele didn't immediately reply, only sat in silence watching the sandy ground with the sparse shrubbery passing slowly by. A light breeze brought a rocky scent with it, making her throat and nose somewhat chalky. Grandfather looked forward with a slight sigh. High in the cloudless sky, the sun cast off a whitish yellow glow, diluting the vivid blue atmosphere. The horizon line was ringed in pale oranges and yellows. Wide open plains of dirt and ragweed surrounded them. Mountains were pale shadows in the far distance, A few lonely desert swallows, tiny brown birds, fluttered from cover to cover, seeking moist foods, their chittering loud and carried across the landscape on the wind. Soon they would be entering the splintered chaos surrounding their homestead. I told the sheriff about Kern Michaels and his gang, and where to find them.
Who is this now?
Grandfather turned to her. Aidele took a breath.
The man who murdered my father. I found out today that his name is Kern Michaels. But the sheriff isn't concerned about him. Wrote it off as nothing. He's out there, terrorizing the countryside, and nobody seems interested in doing anything about it.
She looked away to the shaded mountains far in the distance. Grandfather frowned, saying nothing for a long moment. As he worked through his thoughts, they heard a manger hound howl far off in the distance. He cleared his throat. Perhaps they are doing something. It has only been a few weeks. Be patient. Whoever this man is, he'll be brought to justice.
Not by them. I saw it in his eyes. They have no intention of pursuing this. My father's death remains unpunished, and the sheriff just sits there, sipping coffee and reading books. No, the only real justice one can find out here is what we make for ourselves. It was just as true for my mother. The fucking bitch that killed her is still out there, happy as a pig in shit.
Grandfather shook his head vehemently. Don't bring your mother into this. It's not the same thing. Aidele shook her head and looked forward, crossing her arms over her chest. Her expression was one he had not seen since her childhood. It was a look that said no matter what you told her, she was going to act regardless.
I'm going after Michaels, and I'm putting him down.
Grandfather gritted his teeth. This is not a game. Not like shooting sutramos in the field. These are men who will shoot back. You're not some Red Star sheriff that can take the law into your own hands. Aidele glared at him with furrowed brows.
I read what?
Grandfather cursed inwardly. Never mind. The point is, the sheriff is doing what he can, and we'll deal with this matter. She looked back ahead, straightening in her seat. Her hat cast deep shadows across her brow.
The law in the wastelands is a joke. Half the time just as corrupt as the outlaws, the other half just as useless.
They rode on in silence. Grandfather felt a deep fear and helplessness in his gut. Aidele didn't know how she was going to deal with Kern Michaels. In fact, she didn't know anything about the man save for his name, and that he had a gang. Also, that he was terrorizing the sutures. She sat on the edge of her father's bed, looking around the room. It wasn't a large room, but was impeccably clean. The full-size bed was made up, pillows fluffed. The medium-sized dresser with its backboard mirror was cleared off of any personal items. Beside the clothes closet was a freestanding armoire. By the door was a shoe shelf full of her mother's shoes, and all of it was a chock-full reminder of her parents. Her father's old patchwork jacket was even still hanging on his coat rack. It made her want to start crying again. Stop it, she thought.
This isn't helping you solve your Kern Michaels problem. Grandfather has a gun cabinet in the basement. Right, like he's just gonna let you take one of his classics to murder a man.
She stood up and placed her hands on her lower back, then stretched, causing an audible pop to ring out. Looking out the window behind the bed, she saw the workshop out back. There was another window in the room, but it was blocked by the dresser mirror. She wished it was blocking this one instead. Forcing herself to turn away from the view, she went to the closet. The interior was packed with hanging clothing, coats, pants, dresses. On the floor of the closet, a myriad of her father's shoes and some thick boots. Also, boxes full of whatever knickknacks her parents had collected over the years. Undoubtedly, some would be items that had been exchanged as gifts, token pebbles of love. On the top shelving, more boxes, books, and several colorful choices of gray lances. Brimmed hats worn frequently by wastelanders to protect against the elements, and so named in honor of an old Chahukan pioneer who was one of the first to travel from one end of the wastelands to the other on foot, or so she'd heard once. What really drew her attention was a deep crimson gray lance. She pulled it down, tried it on. Perfect fit. She ran her hand along the brim. It was stiff and covered in a material that was almost like felt. Its center section was crowned by a suede circlet in black. At the end of the closet, which predominantly was taken up by her mother's clothing, She saw a duster hanging of a similar color to the hat. She reached for it and took it out. The lining was a smooth, silky material. The exterior felt like leather. It had 2 pockets on the exterior and 4 in the lining. She slung the coat on. It was heavier than it looked, but comfortable. "Hold me now, Mom," she thought. I'm so lost." Aidele stared into the closet, noting how much of the clothing was Wrangler clothing. Yet, she didn't recall ever having seen her mother wear any of it. Her mother had met her father in Aqua Le Mans, where she was a lab assistant. It was likely she had all of this for the weather, but it was odd she'd never actually worn them around Aidele. She ignored the sudden thought and went over to the bed to take off the coat and hat and lay them down. She'd definitely be wearing them herself. She spent the next 15 minutes going through the dresser, the end table, and finally the armoire, which seemed to have been exclusively used by her father. Rather than it containing clothes, though, it was filled with volumes of journals and writings that contained layouts, schematics, and details of inventions for clients her father used to work for once leaving the city for country life. Years of his thoughts and work filled the shelves top to bottom. At the very bottom she paused. Part of the armoire floor looked warped. The wood there was popping up in the corner. She pushed down on it and she heard a slight click. Digging at the corner resulted in the board coming loose. What she had found was a secret compartment, and inside that compartment, taking up the majority of the space, was a large mahogany box. She managed to claw it out with what little space for her fingers there was, and took it over to the bed. It was heavy, maybe 25 pounds, and bounced on a mattress when she dropped it down. The surface was smooth, with 2 locks on the front. She thumbed them, and they popped open, not locked. The case lid flumped up, and she found herself sitting down on the edge of the bed, eyes wide with disbelief. Inside the box were a pair of revolvers. They were long, and looked to be made with polished steel, or something like steel. The handle was an onyx black, and along the sides were dim red tubes that ran the length, 6 in all, 3 to each side of the muzzle. "Who'd you build these for, Dad?" she thought. "And why haven't we heard from them?" The weapons looked like a mad scientist tried to infuse ancient Tesla technology into antique Smith & Wesson Model 2s. Aidele reached into the case and picked one up. It wasn't as heavy as the case led her to believe. No more than a few pounds, 5 at the most. It was comfortably light, with a trigger grip that fit perfectly in her palm. The triggering mechanism itself was padded with a vulcanized rubber. She held it forward, aiming at her own reflection in a mirror behind a large dresser. The sight seemed well set, likely far more accurate than the pistol she'd been taught to shoot by her father. "Bet I could fire this no problem," she thought. "Used to be a crack shot." Her arm slowly dropped to her thigh until the gun was resting on her lap and she was staring into her own eyes. Could I? She thought about the sheriff and how he showed no inclination of dealing with Michaels. However, now she had 2 tools that would serve her cause. I had my mother's coat, she thought. My father's guns. How just would it be to use them to strike at the heart of all this madness? She looked back to the revolver and checked the ammo chamber. The cartridge could be flipped out, so she removed it and saw that it was empty. In the case were 6 cartridges in a compartment full of a type of bullet she had never seen before. Or have I? She reflected. Wasn't Dad working on these that day Mesmerize got loose? Yeah, he was practice firing them out behind the workshop. Destroyed that dummy's head. She noted there was another compartment built into the lid of the case. Pulling that inner lid open, she saw a handwritten manual and other documents. Those were the instructions, she was positive. Aidele looked in the mirror again, staring at her grim reflection. She placed the weapon back in the case and locked it up, then grabbed it and hurried out of the bedroom. The next 2 weeks, Aidele spent examining drawings, details, and instructions. She marveled at just how impeccable his notes were. Even more astounding was the discovery of who the weapons had been built for. She ran her hand across the surface of one of the revolvers. The metal was, as she'd learned, a Nibirian alloy of the rarest metal. Sitting at the workbench in the shop, she read over her father's words. And as you well know, we've spent the better part of the last decade designing and selling specialized pieces to law enforcement and authorities, clientele who wanted to make a difference.
Yet, things are worse than ever. With these, my love, you can make that difference.
Aidele frowned.
You made these for Mom? But why? She was just a lab assistant, wasn't she?
She read further.
For years, I heard no one would make railgun technology portable and viable. In fact, they were quick to point out that only a dreadnought was capable of generating the energy required to power the technology. And to that I said, hold my beer. You're holding two miniaturized railguns. I have taken to calling them rectifiers, to rectify the wrongs that have been done in this world.
Aidele shook her head.
Geez, Dad, really hamming it up there.
She chuckled quietly.
These weapons will even fire in the depths of space, should such a thing ever prove necessary.
Aidele skipped further along.
They're powered by the natural gravitational well of the planet, any gravitational source really. The firing coils, those red thin tubes running the shaft towards the pistol grip, channel the force towards the bullet chamber. You'll note the firing chamber holds a removable cartridge. Each cartridge contains 15 specialized Marzolite bullets. Their construction allows them to remain in one piece when fired. The kinetic force would obliterate your standard bullet before it ever reached your target. By the spirits, Dad.
Aidele checked the case. There were indeed 6 cartridges full of bullets. Picking up one revolver, she popped the cartridge within. This one contained no bullets, though they did seem to be able to be loaded with actual Marzolite bullets. She reached to change out the cartridge, then stopped. She never heard of Marzolite before and wasn't sure how it handled. Perhaps it was better to walk through the steps first, get a sense of how the weapon held. She continued reading.
Once your cartridge load has been selected and placed, click the chamber into locking position. You'll note 2 thumb discs on one side of each pistol grip. Those indicate the inner side of the revolvers. Sure, you could fire either from both hands. However, facing outward, the discs are a little more challenging to adjust. Of course, you always were flexible. Anyhow, those thumb discs regulate the kinetic force of the rectifiers. I suppose you could call them kinetic regulators if you're looking for a term for them.
Aidele played with the tiny knobs, feeling the thumbnail-sized discs offer up almost inaudible clicks as they twisted.
The very first setting operates more as a sting, like being shot by a BB, a warning to whoever the target is that business is about to get serious.
She furrowed her eyebrows and picked up a Marzolite cartridge to tug a bullet out. It was roughly 5 inches butt to tip, and was about the shape of a cigarette with a domed head. There was an obvious fitting where the bullet head fit into the encasing. Gripping the end with finger and thumb, she pulled. There was a subtle pop as the bullet head came free. The dome and the head could be twisted off and was made of a lightweight material that looked easy to crush. Underneath that dome was a filament, holding a little black metal ball about the size of a small BB. It was her thought that this must be the Marzolite itself.
It's so small. How could this possibly do any damage?
Running her finger along the shaft of this 1.5-inch long bullet head, she felt raised ridges that likely provided a grip for the head when it was emplaced.
This whole filament case is fragile. The second you pulled the trigger, it would completely shatter. How would this even work? I don't get it.
Frowning, she set the bullet head down to pick up its case. She looked inside its depths, saw that it was empty all the way to the bottom of the shell. There was no gunpowder, only a strange spiral design engraved into the shell's inner end.
So how does it fire? Sure, Dad, you said it utilizes gravitational... No way. Wait. If the regulator discs control kinetic force, and the gravitational field provides energy, then...
She stared at the revolvers before her.
By the spirits.
She ran a finger absently around the smooth shell between her fingers, felt the raised ridge of the shell's butt, then reached to the bullet head and replaced it in the shell. After putting it aside, she removed the blank cartridge and pulled one of his bullets out. She repeated the process of removing the head and saw that there was only a twisting dome, no filament inside, just the empty shell.
These are blanks. Does that mean these can fire pure kinetic energy?
She set it down and continued reading, her head feeling light.
On setting 2, the force exhibited can be compared to the average handgun up through the more powerful magnums available in the market. With setting 3, we're getting to the explosive energy of grenades up through guided missiles. Setting 4 starts dishing out broader damage. We're talking the comparative force of stratospheric ballistics up through low-level atomic yields. This does not mean you'll be setting off a nuke, only delivering a similar displacement of energy, though only consider this setting in the last if you intend on ruining someone's day permanently. Now, as for the final setting, it delivers the kinetic punch of thermonuclear weaponry. We're talking in the megaton range. This is unadulterated carnage without radioactive fallout. You could probably level a small town in one shot with this setting. Of course, you'll probably never ever use this setting, but it's good to be made aware of, though.
Aidele tentatively touched the revolvers.
That's impossible. Now, you might be wondering how you could wield such devastating instruments of destruction. Glad you asked. You see, my love, there are kinetic dampeners built into and around the firing shafts. The layouts are in the back of this manual, and it is ingenious if I do say so myself. And since the damage delivered is generally localized, even at the highest settings, the force delivered will be stabilized and not rip your arm off or something. An example, let's say you're target practicing. Maybe a wall is the object of your ire. Setting 1. The bullet bounces off, maybe leaving a dent or a chip, depending on the material. Setting 2. Limited penetration, like the damage left by a handgun. Setting 3. Chunks are torn out of it, up towards whole sections. Setting 4. The wall collapses into its base components, perhaps doing significant damage to whatever's behind it. And on setting 5, you start bringing down buildings up through annihilating neighborhoods. The only material that would stand up to this kind of force would be a dreadnought's hull, though repeated assaults would likely start rending the sheeting apart at the seams.
Aidele straightened her back and looked up to stare off into the distance. There was a cold numbness clawing at her head. These had been made for her mother, and her father had detailed layouts for how to use them. What was going on between them? Were they planning on going vigilante to take on crime in the wastelands? It made an odd kind of sense, if so. Her parents spent a lot of time away after they moved to the ranch. Her father would be home on the weekends, but her mother would sometimes be gone a whole month. She looked down to those rectifiers.
Rectifiers. Sorry, Dad, I'm not calling them that. That's just silly.
Her hand reached out for the right-hand iron.
Iron. Yes, that sounds better.
Checking the firing chamber, she found that the cartridge was blanks as well. She stood up, grabbed a right-handed revolver, and rounded the table. Across the room, there were a series of metal shelves along the back wall. She saw a training dummy that her father used to use to display new clothing designs and grip the iron tighter. The grip was comfortable in her palm as she came to the end of the table and took a gunslinger stance. She took aim with both hands, anticipating what the result would be. She thumbed the disc all the way down to the first increment of setting 1. There were micro increments she discovered between each setting that clicked as the disc turned. This, she figured, was likely how the gun was able to replicate the displaced energy of various firearms. She pulled the trigger. A strange buzzing came from it and a slight thrum ran up her arms. The firing coils glowed a brighter and brighter red. A line of light came out of the barrel, targeting the dummy's head. Then a flash filled the room, followed by a barely audible thump, almost sounding like the blowing of a hard wind. It all took less than a second. Aidele sighed and resumed her gunslinger stance. The gun hadn't even rattled her arms, so she decided to give setting 2 a try. She took aim, pulled the trigger. Flash, thump. Louder this time, the thrum deeper. The dummy wavered, and her brows knitted tighter.
So, the kinetic force itself can affect the target, just whips of energy.
Her taut facial features were focused and ready to experiment. Once more she took the stance, only this time she dropped her left hand and held the iron outward one-handed. Its weight was somewhat hefty, but not tiring. She thumbed the disc up to setting 3. The flash was brighter than before. The thrumph now a thrum. The dummy wavered like it would fall over. The metal shelves behind the dummy wobbled violently, but eventually settled, though some tools did fall off the shelves onto the floor. She lowered the iron to her side, her face full of awe.
This shouldn't be possible. No gravitational plating can affect objects over great distances. Even cargo sleds just hover over the surface, not affecting the ground.
She shook her head.
The reason why they say it's impossible is because only a dreadnought can generate that kind of power. And yet, these can fire pure kinetic energy when not loaded.
Her gaze fell on the dummy again, and she re-raised the weapon. Then she bypassed setting 4 and thumbed the regulator disc all the way to its highest setting. She inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly, allowing a cold calm to wash over her, then pulled the trigger. Aidele didn't see so much as feel a thunderous roar, the flash blinding. A split second later, sounds of splintering wood, shredding metal, the rapturous din of a building being wrecked filled her world. When her eyes refocused, there was a gaping hole through the workshop. It looked like a metal-munching shark had risen up through the dirt and taken a huge bite out of the building. The back wall was gone. Little more than debris settling across the yard beyond for a dozen feet or more. The dummy and shelving had been decimated into tiny shreds of metal, cotton, rubber, and plastics. She lowered the gun. Holy shit. And that was without the ammunition. No recoil, minimal vibration in the arms. A regular gun would have exploded into a hailstorm of shrapnel, killed me in the blowback. By the spirits, Dad, why did you build these for Mom?
Aidele!
She slowly turned to see Grandfather staring in horror. Are you okay? What happened? She glared down at the gun in her hand and then laid it gently on the tabletop. There was a haunted expression on her face. I'll fix it. When I have a moment, I'll fix it. Grandfather wandered inside and looked at the guns on the workbench, then cast his glance out at what was left of the workshop. Finally, he turned to her. Did those do that? Aidele nodded. I'm sorry, I'll take care of it, I promise. Grandfather looked around again and sighed. Just don't hurt yourself. Try not to destroy any more of the ranch. Okay. Grandfather left, leaving Aidele to stare at the guns in something of a horrified awe. The typical railgun requires 4 immense electromagnets to generate the energy necessary to fire 1 round of advanced tungsten. One regulation railgun cannon is 164 feet long and able to fire a slug the size of a full-grown man. Mounting even one cannon to a standard warship or tank would be impractical, as firing it would utterly vaporize the vehicle in question. Even though only the rarely built dreadnought is capable of powering railgun technology, it's also the only man-built machine with a hull durable enough to stand up to the force. On top of that, one railgun can, at the fastest rate, only fire once per 5 minutes as the systems recharge. A reason why each dreadnought put into service has in its arsenal 20 cannons. Given this knowledge, one can reasonably understand why Aidele was confused at how her newfound irons could actually utilize railgun technology. At first, while spending a week thoroughly examining the blueprints in the back of the manual, she thought it was all about generating the energy required via gravitational conversion. And in a way, that was the most basic truth of the process. What she discovered, however, was the process was enhanced by miniature modules that were producing micro black holes at the subatomic level. This was powered by the firing coils that adjusted the kinetic force. Since this was using gravity, there was no power per se. She had to shake her head at the cleverness of it all. Gravitational plating had been around since well before the Civil War. Generally speaking, the plating hadn't been used in such a way, only used for lifting carts and vehicles to make them easier to manage, like magnets to create a polar opposite, or in the foundations of new colonies. Well, there was also in the recreational sense as well. The technology was used in certain water sports where the vehicles worked in conjunction with hydrotech to propel the vessel across the surface, but that was limited in scope. There were also usages in children's entertainment. Be amazed at the floating flea circus. Feast your eyes on Alexander's super rodents. Marvel at Henrietta's dragon snakes, and etc. ad nauseum. Yet, here were 2 revolvers that defied everything currently understood about the limits of gravitational utilization. Her father, the late great Cooper Wilson, much like those magicians of crafty children's tricks, had performed the greatest magic feat ever. The incredible miniaturized railgun. The awesome power to level a small city had just been placed into the palm of her hands. Literally. And she was going to use them to avenge his death. Over several weeks, She learned the ins and outs of the irons, learned how to construct the ammunition via a mode she discovered on one of the shelves in the workshop, fortunately not one that had been obliterated in the initial test session. She fixed the workshop during this time, using materials from the blacksmith in town, and worked out a plan of attack against Kern Michaels and his outlaw cohorts. She would start in Chiswick Villa, head town to town, kicking over every stone, dealing with every thug until she was face to face with Kern himself. She'd stare him in the eyes, make sure he knew who it was that had taken him down. When the time had come, Aidele loaded up everything she would need for a prolonged stay out in the wilds onto Mesmerize. She included in her stocks a small little ball about the size of a bouncer sphere. She'd found it in a case in the workshop. Apparently her father called it a splitter. The man was full of surprises. Once done packing up her mount, she headed inside to gear up. She slung on a gun belt she'd specially made for her irons, fitting the cartridge pouches with spare ammunition and 6 cartridges. The shirt she chose was a white button-up, her jeans thick and denim blue. She donned her mother's duster, gray lance, and black leather boots. She mounted Mesmerize and rode out to the front of the house. Grandfather was on the porch, sitting in his rocker, staring out over the horizon of the ridge. She slowed and looked at him. "I'm going out to find him. However long it takes. I won't be back until it's done." Aidele awaited an answer. None was forthcoming. Grandfather raised the cup to his lips and took a sip, his eyes still in the distance. "Have it your way, then." She grumbled and kicked Mesmerize into a gallop. There was a sense that Grandfather's eyes were on her as she headed out for Chiswick and her revenge. She put it out of mind and pushed Mesmerize into a run. For 3 months, Aidele scoured the countryside, riding town to town. Chiswick Villa had proven less useful in the long haul, but still gave her the knowledge that saloons were the best places for scuttlebutt. The rumor mill kept her town hopping. The vagaries of outlaws running contraband or raiding farms, the bandits in the hills outside of this town or that, pushed her forward, kept her moving. By the 4th town, a little shabby village up past the spine along the cliffside called Willard's Peak, a mad fear was starting to take hold. It screamed that she'd never pick up Kern's trail. Even Treaton, the first stop from Chiswick, told her nothing of the Michaels gang, with no one willing to say more than, "I ain't never heard of 'em." However, it was in Willard's Peak that she ran across a helpful, smiling, and not the least bit intimidatingly creepy barkeep, who was more than willing to offer up some advice. He glared down at her, his eyes never turning away, his face never letting his smile drop, the glass in his hand ceaselessly polished. "I must say, young lady, nobody is going to talk to you. Not the way you're going at it." Aidele shifted her gaze up at him, gripped her glass of bourbon a little bit harder. "What makes you say that, Tender?" "This town is rather remote. Sure, you have your out-of-towners every now and again. But if you don't talk the talk, they'll be more likely to put you 6 feet under, rather than give you the time of day. Certainly, they're not going to be willing to discuss the doings of one outlaw there's a good chance they'll run across, regardless of the sob story you might give for avenging a family member." Aidele frowned at the tall, bespectacled man. He looked far more like an accountant, with his black vest and pants and white undershirt, than he did a bartender. He was sociable enough, she figured, but there was an underlying menace to him she just couldn't put her finger on. He was too polite, too focused, knew too much. She thought her conversations with the locals quiet, but apparently he'd gotten word nonetheless. The man put down the glass and leaned his hands on the countertop and hovered over her like they were thick as thieves. "I suppose you might have some advice in that matter, do you?" "I might at that. Big city girls stick out like a sore thumb." "I'm not from the big city." He chuckled. "Wherever you're from, you're not local. And you act like you don't belong. You want to get them talking? You're going to have to talk the talk. Walk the walk. You'll have to become one of them. When you walk down the street, they have to believe you're right where you're supposed to be." As he stood to his full 6'3" height, he pushed up the rim of his glasses and crossed his arms. She sat back, craning her neck up at him. "You don't exactly sound like a local yourself, sir." The returning chuckle was deep as it reverberated from his chest. Elliot will do. And no, I'm not from around here. However, I've been known to converse in the local mannerisms. When I after, of course. So what are you saying? Just hang out at a table in the back and just listen to how everyone speaks? Then what, feign the dialect? His grin broadened. It's a start, but I'd suggest not feigning it. No, you have to be true to the words falling from your gullet, if you catch my drift. Aidele pursed her lips, finished her bourbon, and stood up. Before she could utter another word, he spoke again. As far as your problem goes, might I suggest making your next destination Oscar's Lookout, down by Greeley. Of course, you might want to get your act together first. The wastelands are a violent place. I would hate to know I've sent you to your death. It would be most unfortunate. A disconcerted tension clawed up her body, and she wanted nothing more than to be done with the grinning barkeep as soon as humanly possible. She reached up to tip her hat and nodded. Thank you again, Elliot. She tried not to look like she was beating a hasty retreat. The smile said, look at me, I'm friendly, but the tone of his words and his looming presence told her a different story. Come on, Aidele. If the barkeep is going to creep you out, why are you doing this? There are going to be more threats coming, and you better get used to being challenged. Even though Elliot was unconventional, she took his advice to heart and spent the next several weeks just listening to folks and speaking to the occasional gambler and saloon patron. The urgency to accomplish her task was constant, but she knew she had to get the information, and to do that, she had to be patient. Her first few attempts at speaking local dialects were not pretty. In fact, if she was being honest with herself, it had been downright ugly. Howdy there, pardner, she drawled. The man seated across from her, a poker player, paused in mid-shuffle. She'd acquired a deck of cards from this town's barkeep and sat herself down at a big round table. After simply shuffling for a bit, this man, a James Whitman, had asked if he could join her for a hand or two. She'd smiled and eagerly agreed, and pushed the deck his way. Now, mere moments later, he was staring at her, mouth agape, trying to force down the incredulous smile boiling to the surface. I'm sorry, where are you from again, Missy? James inquired, hands gripping the cards back into a straight pile. She smiled. Oh, just out from around these parts. Got a nice little firm out in the plains. He laughed and started to raise up. You know what? I just remembered I gotta fetch some wheat from General, or I would be real sore and forget that. He left then with a wave, and Aidele felt her face flush. Several further tries went much the same way, mostly because it was less about the words themselves than it was the inflection used. If she were to write down what she heard, it'd look ridiculous. If she wrote down, this here's what all the fuss is about, she'd inevitably say it with some over-the-top twangy attempt that sounded much like, this here's what all the fuss is about. It took 3 more weeks to get to a point where she was reasonably capable of fitting in with the local populaces. She was even beginning to dream in the inflections. It wasn't until halfway through the week after her efforts began to pay off. She was sitting in the back of a saloon, having greeted one of the locals and invited him for a drink. He was nervous, even more so when she asked him about Kern Michaels. Though he'd been quiet throughout the conversation, he completely lost his voice with her query. His eyes shifted in quick darts. I know you're scared, she drawled, reaching out to steady his hand with her own. And I know you don't want to be involved. However, I have to find this man. His legs started bouncing and he looked past her shoulder. Aidele let go of his hand and casually turned to look back. 2 men were carrying on and laughing, harassing the hostess who was trying to make a retreat, but kept getting stopped by a wandering hand grabbing her buttocks. Aidele twisted back in the chair, but the man was gone. To wherever she could only guess, but his reaction suggested those men were somehow involved with Kern Michaels. So she took the seat on the opposite side of the table where her guests had sat and watched, waiting to see what they'd do next. She was on her 3rd bourbon when they stood and exited through the half doors out the front, laughing and stumbling. Aidele took in a deep breath, found her resolve, and stood. Exhaling sharply, she followed the men outside. They were already rounding the corner of the building and into an alley as she hit the outer deck. She hurried off into the dirty, dusty side street and stopped. They were steadily swaying down the way, singing a loud melody and trying to avoid the support columns of an overhanging balcony to the building opposite saloon. "Hey!" she called, adopting a gunslinger stance, her hands on the grips of her irons. The men were lightning fast. In the time it took her to swallow, they'd both pulled their good hand pistols, turned and taken aim. Their reactions those of the stone-cold sober. They were less than a dozen feet from her. The one to her left, Thug 1, was a taller, maybe 6 feet, with blonde hair and a freshly grown beard covering a sharp, angular jaw. He wore a tan jacket, blue jeans, and a dark blue shirt, but filthy from whatever it was he'd been rolling around in. To her right, Thug 2. He was several inches shorter than Thug 1, with wavy brown hair and clean-shaven features. His rounded jaw was clenched, pistol held out in his right hand, parallel with his buddy's left-handed grip. He wore a blue suede jacket and black jeans. A scent of manure wafted through the air, and Aidele got the sense these two hadn't bathed in a long while.
"Where's Kern Michaels?"
Smirks gathered under visages, which turned into chuckles and then outright laughter. Thug 1 dropped his revolver back into its holster while Thug 2, still dangling his weapon, draped his gun arm over Thug 1's left shoulder and drunkenly guffawed into it. Rhett, she's playing cowboy." "She sure is," Thug 1, a.k.a. Rhett, laughed. "That's good for one walk away, missy. Kern's got himself enough fillies right now. Why don't you run along and play at home now before you get hurt?" Both men turned and started back down the alleyway, stumbling around the support beams of the overhead deck and around a stack of crates and a water trough. Both still laughed boisterously. Aidele's heart raced as she found herself hurrying after them. She grabbed Thug 2's wrist. "I want to know what Kern Michaels is now," she howled. The men turned on her, menacing eyes glaring down, hands hovering over their death dealers ready to draw. A tremor came up her gut and she forced it back down, returning their fierce gazes with one of her own. Through gritted teeth, a growl came up Thug 2's corded neck. "Girl, you best run along now. We won't be telling you again." For a moment, a paralyzing fear gripped her. Then something deeper within her surfaced, causing her to drive her knee into his crotch. Thug 2 doubled over with a screaming rage as Rhett yelled and grabbed her by the left wrist. Aidele spun into him and found herself being flipped over the stack of crates. Several things happened all at once. Keeping hold of Rhett's sleeve, she pulled him after her, obscenities hurling with abandon. She managed to pull her right iron, thumbing the disc to around setting 3, aimed at a crate in the general direction of Thug 2, and fired. The blast tore through the crates as Big and Ugly was pulling his piece, and straight through his calf, shredding his lower leg. The tail end of the shot splintered a large portion of the building exterior across the alley. Raging howls of excruciating pain escaped Thug 2's mouth as he collapsed to the ground, gripping his thigh. Aidele hit the ground, and Rhett quickly lunged after her. "You little whore!" Rhett spat, pinning her arms behind her back and lifting her off her feet. "On second thought, I bet Kern could use a new girl. After I get done with you first, that is." He lifted again, and she grunted, tossing her legs out to find purchase on one of the support columns. She thrust backwards, causing them both to careen into a building wall. His grip loosened, allowing her to drop back to the ground. Before he could reassert that clutching grasp, she thrust up, ramming her head into his face. He let go completely, stumbling back and reaching up to his now gushing nose. "You broke my nose, you whore!" She pulled her left iron and fired at him. The energy unleashed from the loaded blanks flung Rhett back into the wall, eyes wide. A loud and sickening crack echoed outward, and he went motionless as he slid down into a slump. Aidele gathered her wits, holstered her left iron, and picked up her right where it lay in the ground. Then staggered over to where Thug 2 lay rolling and screaming in the dirt. Standing over him, she held her revolver to his growling face.
"Now you tell me where's Kern Michaels."
"Fuck you!" Spittle flew from his mouth as she brought her boot down on what was left of his calf, hanging loosely by a coil of tendon and bloody meat, bones splintered and exposed. The sound that came from him was akin to the raging wails of a banshee, and she wanted to vomit. That he was still conscious was a testament to his fortitude, and a reminder of how dangerous he and his brothers all were. Right this moment she wished to be anywhere than there, but she pushed through her nausea and allowed rage to take over. "Where's Kern Michaels?" Her howl competed with his pain. "Easton, you fucking cunt! Easton! Easton!" Bloody spittle flew into her face. "But believe you me, when he hears about what you done here, you won't need go looking for him, 'cause he'll be coming for you." She held the revolver to his temple and pulled the trigger. His skull erupted into bits of bone and brain, covering her head and upper torso and spreading out into the dirt in sinuous mounds. Aidele stumbled backwards into the wall, slumping to the ground, iron dangling from her hand. Her eyes were fixated on the dead man, and she felt both a rush of adrenaline and a tremoring fear. A woman's wail pulled her from her reverie, and she turned her head right. A crowd had gathered at the end of the alley. Some were staring at the hole she'd made to the building beyond, others at her and pointing.
"Oh my God! Call the sheriff! She's murdered them!"
Aidele leapt to her feet and saw that at some point her hat had flown off. She grabbed it and raced down the alleyway away from them. Bells rang, voices screamed, and she didn't stop to see if anyone were giving chase. She doubled back to the other side of the saloon, saw that everyone in town was down that alleyway and not looking in her direction. She untied Mesmerized and beat a hasty retreat out of town. Campfire light bounced in a wide circle, bathing Aidele underneath a warm glow. Her knees were drawn to her chest as she stared deep into the flickering flames. Nearby, Mesmerized grazed with little snorts. His reins were tied to a thick tree, one of many that made up this small glen. The stars twinkled brightly far above. Crickets chirped loudly. A subtle wind blew through the leaves on the trees. At her feet, a stream of ants was up to some late-night foraging. The whole world at peace, except it wasn't. Visions of viscera danced in her head. She found herself suddenly sick and leapt up to race towards some brush where she promptly lost everything she'd eaten that day. For a long while she remained prostrate, heaving and sobbing, her eyesight blurred by tears.
"I killed him. Murdered him."
The vivid sight of the man welling, his blood, bone, and spit taunting her with its rawness.
And probably his buddy too. The fuck did I do? Is this what it's gonna be like?
She rubbed her face and leaned back to stare off into some unseen distance. They'd ridden for hours until she was certain no lawmen were on her trail. It all made her feel like a criminal, and maybe she was now, she reflected sourly. However, those men were murderers and rapists, outlaws in the employ of one Kern Michaels, and if the law wasn't willing to deal with them, was it so bad if a local dealt with the son of a bitch?
Does that mean they won't come after me? If they're willing to let a fucker like him run roughshod?
Aidele looked to Mesmerize.
We have a choice, don't we? Oh boy. Go back home crying to grandfather that he was right, like always, or continue on with this horrible, wretched task because no one else will.
Mesmerized stood staring at her and munching on some grass, his ears flicking sporadically. She nodded at him.
I suppose you're right. Can't just go running back home. Not now. Not after what I've already done. And what is left to accomplish.
She wasn't really looking at him as he snorted and went back to chomping at the grass.
I started this. I have to finish it. Besides, we're not talking about good men here, or now are we?
Mesmerized shook his head and clomped his rear foot, likely due to flies, but she nodded as if it were an affirmative.
No. Good men don't make the law turn a blind eye. Good men don't infest the country with vile urges and vicious ways. Good men aren't reviled and feared. Only a malignant cancer is looked at with such scorn and fills people with such helplessness.
She looked down and watched the trail of ants for a long moment, then to Mesmerize and smiled.
Let's say we cut it out of the sutures.
Mesmerize whinnied, and she stood to go over to where her coat lay out flat like a makeshift bed. She pulled her saddlebag over to use as a pillow and lay down with her head propped up. She folded her arms behind her head and stared up at the night sky. A ripple of dark colors flowed from horizon to horizon. She sighed and closed her eyes. They spent the next 2 days in the glen. They started with Easton and discovered Kern had already moved on. Rumor had it that he'd taken up in Lover's Bluff. At least that was the general consensus at a few men loyal to Kern in town, anyhow. She went to a cartographer, got a map of the sutures, and proceeded to the next destination. Every time she found she just missed him, and he was always one step ahead. Her life became a constant process of blending in, finding those followers of his, putting them down, and then tearing across the dusty plains like a wraith, bringing the fury of hell right along with her. What little law there was mostly stayed out of the way. Very few asked questions, merely commented it was Wastelander's business, and occasionally pointed her in the right direction. It was a disgrace, and it filled her with even more rage, and she was less afraid of venting that rage on animals that considered themselves men, such as the gang member that was holed up in the whorehouse in Drury getting his jollies. Nobody stopped her as she entered the front door, asked the madam where the filth was, and made her way up the stairs. She was pretty sure a lot of people cut out upon seeing the fierce look of her resolve and wicked revolver clutched tightly in her hand. The door shattered under her kick, its light frame buckling easily. The woman within was screaming even before Aidele had reached the room. Splintered boards came to a rest on the floor, and she saw her latest prey hovering menacingly over the harlot, his fists balled, her face bloody. Aidele raised her iron towards the man and squinted. "That ain't in the lady's job description," she stated with a caustic edge. "How about you dismount, little feller, and you come tangle with me?" The nude harlot, with her swelling black eyes, cried out as she leapt off the bed and raced out of the room. The naked outlaw slid off the bed himself, a snarl on his face. His cock dangled limply, covered in a shaggy black hedge of wiry hair. Aidele was repulsed. "Fuck you want then?" Scowl crossed his bearded visage. "Come to play, whore? Take off in jammies and we'll play." She cocked her iron and narrowed her eyes. "You ain't gonna like the kind of fucking I have in mind. On your knees and reach for the roof." "And if not, refuse?" The nightstand beside him and part of the bed exploded into 1,000 shards of wood and shredded bedding. He winced at the bright light and cacophonous noise. She recocked the hammer, and he whimpered, dropping to his knees and raising his hands. A fresh breeze blew in from the new hole in the wall. Startled screams rose up from outside. Aidele saw his little man turtle up to near nothing and worked to stifle a grin. "I ain't much in a talking mood, so you tell me now and I'll make it quick. Where's Kern Michaels?" He trembled, but she couldn't tell if it was because of her threat or his fear of Kern. His eyes darted around the room before landing back on her, not quite making eye contact. "Can't tell you that. You're just gonna have to kill me." The anger rose in her hot as fire. They never made it easy. Couldn't just tell her what she wanted to know. No, she had to get violent. She took 2 heavy steps towards him, flipping her iron over so it was pistol gripped towards him and raised it high. The outlaw saw it coming and brought his hands up, only she was already in mid-swing. Each blow she made came with a word. Each word had a growling emphasis. Each emphasis came with an even more violent blow. "Where is Kern Michaels?" She stood back from where he lay on the floor, his body twitching and face a bloody mash. His jaw hung loosely and looked shattered. His eyes stared blankly towards the wall. Shit. A loud commotion like tables being overturned and a few startled voices came from downstairs as she looked over her shoulder to stare down the hall beyond. Garbled grunting caused her to sigh as she made out gruff voices. "Get out of here! Shooting's about to start!" "Where's she at?" "Upstairs. Heard it from Lulu." "Guess his buddies decided to pay me a visit. All the better. I done broke this'n." She holstered her iron and pulled the left one still loaded with blanks. She popped that cartridge out to exchange for a Marzolite one. She thumbed the disc to 3, holstered it, redrew to right, thumbed it to setting 2, reholstered it. No sense killing them all just yet. Spare one for a long talk. She walked to what was left of the wall and its one window. People were rushing down the street, and she saw there was no way to safely drop down and take them by surprise to the front. "By the stairwell, then. Let's go say hi, young'un." She turned back towards the door, her hands hovering over her revolvers, and walked down the hall to the stairwell. It was quiet. She took her time descending. Halfway down, once she was past the second floor and could see where it became ceiling, she stopped. In the main brothel foyer, she saw 4 men. All were watching her, hands itching to pull the revolvers. Well, 3 were ready to dance, nervous eyes continuing to question the one man sitting at a table, feet up on a chair, pouring a whiskey for himself. That one leaned back to give her a knowing smile. He looked to be in his mid to late 40s, the chiseled jaw, trimmed down beard with flecks of gray in it, puffy mustache, and calm demeanor told her that he was the man in charge. The muscles in her hand twitched in anticipation. Fear and rage welled in her gut. She was sure it was him at long last. He placed his glass on the tabletop. "Now, I've been hearing some interesting rumors lately." His voice was grating, not quite deep, not quite high. Somehow it was a mixture of both, like he'd never fully grown out of puberty. If not for that beard and bushy mane of hair on top of his head, she might have suspected as such. "The rumors go, some little girl was riding all over the sutures, killing my men, screaming about how she's trying to find that some bitch Kern Michaels." "Are you him? Are you Kern Michaels?" Aidele ventured. "As a matter of fact, I am. And who might I have the pleasure of getting to know?" "Aidele Wilson." She put extra emphasis on Wilson. "You and your gang murdered my father." She didn't expect an apology, maybe a grunt or a sigh, but she certainly hadn't planned on him bursting out into laughter. Raucous, hearty laughter that got his 3 cohorts rolling too. Burning anger heated her face. "Woman, I done killed a lot of pappies over my life. What makes you think yours is any more special?" Her lips drew back. "His name was Cooper Wilson, professor out in Chesapeake Villa. You and your lot gunned him down coming home." Her smile vanished and his demeanor turned from sociable to grim. "Right." He leapt to his feet, tossing the table over. His 3 men opened fire in her position. She drew her revolvers in the same instance, killing 1 man. She shot the floor in front of the other 2, causing it to explode and sending them reeling backwards as she leapt over the banister and rolled into cover behind the madam's counter. To their credit, Kern's men weren't incapacitated for long and opened up where she knelt low. With her left iron, she leaned around the counter corner, saw Kern taking aim, and fired at the center of the table he was cowering behind. He ducked just as the shot hit and the table was obliterated. There was no time to see if she'd hit him as the bullet shredded the counter. One went deep into Aidele's thigh. She retreated towards the back room, firing at the stairwell. It collapsed into a heap, blocking the hallway as she made her escape out through a back door. Outside, 2 more of Kern's men were waiting with drawn guns and wide eyes. She saw they were underneath a balcony and aimed at its support beams. The shot went straight through, too, and the whole structure came down on top of them. She hobbled across the street towards where Mesmerized was tied up and retreated. Kern came racing outside from the front, he and his men firing at her as she fled. They stopped when Kern lowered his weapon and shouted, "Don't you come back round, Wilson. Next time we won't think twice about killing you. Just put a bullet in your head the second I sees you." He didn't put any effort into chasing after her, and his voice died into quiet gibberish. A week later, she was sitting at her campsite healing up, but more determined than ever. She was twirling the spherical splitter she'd found in her father's workshop in her hands, thinking about how everything had played out. Sure, she'd been driven out of town, but she also saw fear in Kern's eyes, and that filled her with a kind of joy she'd never experienced before. "Maybe in our next encounter, I'll give you a present, Kern. I've got just the gift." She'd failed in their first meeting, but just in rattling him, she knew she wouldn't fail next time. He was afraid. Why else would he and his crew not come after her? She put the splitter down and went to the map splayed out before her. Little check marks were by every town she'd rode through chasing Kern. The last little town she'd been to, Scuttlebutt said Kern was making a beeline for Dodge, which was interesting because that was one of the towns she'd been through already. And the village before the last one, she had heard tell of his heading towards Bastion. A pattern was emerging on his travel habits. He was blowing into towns, staying no more than 2 days, creating chaos, sometimes killing the local lawmen, loot, pillage, and move on. But it was never precisely town to town. He would hit 3 in a row, then double back to the first, if that town happened to have picked up new lawmen when he'd killed them before. He'd killed this bunch too. Then he'd move forward to what would have been the fourth town in a line had he not doubled back to begin with. The exact reason for this behavior escaped her. However, she figured it was Kern Michaels and he was deranged, so maybe it was all a game to him. She was certain she'd nailed the pattern, but she'd have to test her theory first before taking him on. She picked a town that was likely to be his fourth and would ride out there a day after she expected him to move on. If she was right, in 2 weeks she'd make for Rented City. This time, she'd be waiting for him. Let him get comfortable, settle in, to strike relentlessly. Aidele ran the brush through her hair again. 3 months hunting them all across the sutures. Now they were dead, and the countryside could rest easy knowing their terror was driven 6 feet under, and her father could rest as well. She put the brush down and sighed. The face in the mirror wasn't smiling. In fact, it looked anything but happy. It looked worn, tired, and hard. And not for the first time she wondered who she was now. The Aidele from before a few months earlier couldn't be seen. Crickets chirped happily outside her window, and she could hear the unnatural swirl of dust blowing across the dustlands far to the west. Somewhere in the dark, a manger howled mournfully. It was almost calming. Standing up, she crossed to the bed, grabbing her father's journal, then went to sit by the window. The white rocker creaked as she sat and stared out into the darkness. It was a clear night. Moonlight cast a dim white aura over the pastures and ridges beyond. The barn was a faint silhouette. Light from her twin oil lamps cast a yellow outline of her window across the ground outside, and it was quiet, very, very quiet in their little corner of the sutures. She sighed and hugged the journal to her chest. It's over now. All of it. You can rest. I can rest. Grandfather can rest. We all can rest. She felt her heart beating in her chest underneath her cotton gown. And tomorrow, I'll get back to looking after the herd and the crops, and we'll all get back to the way it was. She looked down to the journal. I can't read any of your words right now. You had so many of them, so many ideas. So you sleep now, and later we can talk some more. She gave a slight smile. Aidele reached over to the window and closed it to a crack to keep out the predators, but give her enough cool air so she wouldn't sweat to death. She stood up, closed the thin white curtains, and went to her closet. There she opened the doors and with her foot pulled over a step stool sitting in the inside corner. Stepping up to the top shelf, she pushed several boxes aside and ran her hand along their surface until a hatch popped up with a muffled poof. Inside was an empty storage compartment, large enough to hold 3 hardback books and an assortment of keepsakes. Standing in front of the closet, the shelf didn't look that thick. There was a stylized horizontal panel covering the whole closet rod. With the lids shut, the compartment was invisible. Aidele placed the journal inside, shut the lid, and then stepped off the footstool. She pushed it back into the corner inside the closet and closed the doors back, and then went over to turn out her oil lamps. She hopped into bed, pulling the sheet to her chest, and placed her arms behind her head. A deep, contented sigh left her lips, and she stared at her dark ceiling, moonlight bouncing off the back wall. How long before I find more enemies? Grandfather, I love you. Sometimes you're an alarmist. I'll be fine. I don't need new enemies. More than enough out here to keep me happy. Oh, so ends chapter 2. Alright, here we go. Well, that ends chapter 2. If you stuck around this long, I would like to thank you. I appreciate your taking the precious time out of your day to listen to me regale you with the adventures of Aidele Wilson as we move along in this long, long book. If you've gotten this far and you're enjoying this, by all means, please click on one of the links down below. Go and pick up your own copy of Red Star Sheriff, now available on Amazon Kindle. For some reason, I can't do external links anymore, since YouTube has taken that ability away. I can do that in the description, but I cannot do it in the main video body itself. So I'll just have images here that say click down below. I wish I could do annotations. That doesn't seem, whoa. That doesn't seem to be that doesn't seem to be a thing either anymore either, for some unusual reason. It's very odd. I don't know what YouTube's doing, but hey, whatever. I've got links down below. You can go to my author site. You can go to the book, and check it out for yourself. So, thanks for watching. Come back later for more material. I am still working on animations to put up. I got some other projects in the pipeline as well. So, until next time, take it easy and still don't have a sign off. So until next time, take it easy. Bye.